As the 1960s wound down, there was great turmoil within the German camera industry, specifically at Zeiss Ikon, which really, probably unknown to most consumers, was in its final stages of existence. Now, this is a camera company that had been around since the late 1920s, and 40 years later, it was pretty much really on its last legs. However, there were a couple models to be released, and among them was this one. This was the Zeiss Ikon 310, specifically the Zeiss Ikon S310 Contessa. This was the last camera to bear the Contessa name. At the same time, Zeiss Ikon released two other cameras. Zeiss Ikon released these two models, the S312 and the Voigtlander VF101. By this time, Voigtlander was fully part of the Zeiss Ikon empire or company. It's a long story. Let's just leave it at that. So there were three models. I could not find a companion model for the S310. I could only find a companion model for the rangefinder-equipped S312. So we'll just run through these models real quickly. These were fairly compact cameras, as you can tell. They were intended to, I think they were intended to probably compete with the Rollei 35, which had really took the industry by storm. If you recall, the Rollei 35, it was and is a very small, compact 35 millimeter camera, and there's quite a bit to like about it. And this one also, actually, these are very functional cameras. Very briefly, all of them use Tessar type lenses. In fact, these two are Tessar lenses, while this is a color Scopar, which is a Tessar type. It's very possible that the three are simply identical lenses, and this is just rebranded as a Scopar. This is a scale focus camera, which means you guess on the focus, while these two have integrated coupled rangefinders. All three had an electric eye or metering here, and the cell was here and here on these two models, and off to the side for this particular model. They're sturdy cameras. They're not too large, and they're very. If you pick up one of these cameras, you can obviously feel that there's a lot of metal in them. There's probably not a lot of plastic in the use. I believe this might be plastic, and there's a couple of other pieces that are plastic. For the most part, they're primarily metal construction. Obviously share a lot of features. They have top-mounted shutter. They have top-mounted frame counters. They all have a hot shoe right on this side. These two cameras have, this particular camera has a flash synchronization post in addition to the hot shoe. However, these two cameras do not. All three have either flash or automatic exposure mode. If you turn this to the flash symbol, it actually turns off the meter. So that's a nice little thing to keep in mind if you don't want to run down your battery. Your battery check light is here and here on these two cameras. This camera has no battery check light. So, like I said, it's slightly different from the other two. What isn't different is how you remove the back on the three cameras. This has film in it, so we're not going to remove the back. These use the small little flip-up key. Turn it so it's horizontal, and the back will now slide off of the camera. Same with this. Turn this key horizontal, and the back slides off the camera. You'll notice that this knob here, this is your battery chamber. And we'll get to that in just a moment. These are fairly clean on the inside. This has a hinged pressure plate. So the purpose of the pressure plate, of course, is to keep your film flat against the film rails so that when you take your photo, your film is as flat as possible and you take presumably a sharp photo. And it's always dependent on, one of the factors is that you have a lens capable of producing a sharp photograph. So as I mentioned, when you replace the back, you slide it into these two channels until it's fully seated. Don't let it hang out like it did before. The two halves should be pushed together firmly. Take this little key, turn it until it's perpendicular to the rest of the body, and folds flat. And it doesn't matter if the key is this way or this way. Either way works. Now let's take a look at this knob. This knob here holds the batteries. Originally, this held 4 Type 625 batteries. What's interesting is that the owner's manual, because normally those batteries, only the output of them was 1.4 volts, I believe, or 1.3 volts, 3.5 volts. But the owner's manual specifies 1.5 volts. So that's rather interesting. So when I first opened this up, I saw 4 batteries in here, so I just sort of felt or assumed that it was a 6-volt camera. But in fact, it's not true. It's only a 3-volt camera, so it uses 2 cells in series, and then the 2 groups are in parallel. And I believe that's so two batteries don't provide enough amperage to power the entire camera. And really, you're only talking about powering the light meter and the shutter, because it is an electronically controlled shutter. Without batteries, it only operates, I believe, at the flash synchronization speed, which is 1/30th of a second. In fact, the manual states that in an emergency, you can just use 2 batteries. And the more I thought about this, the more I thought, well, in addition to the inavailability today of the Type 625 batteries, or at least, mercury batteries, or batteries that would give you a steady voltage, I thought, is there a way to convert this to use a different type of cell? And so interestingly enough, you can convert this so we'll use a 123 lithium cell. And so if you look at this, this is pretty much the same circumference and roughly the same length as a lithium cell. So is it possible to convert this camera to allow the use of a lithium cell? And the answer is yes. It's actually quite easy. And really, all you have to do is you have to remove this battery holder, this red battery holder, and just replace a couple of the screws, and you're good to go. I do add one other piece. It's fairly simple to do, and it's just a little insert that I put into the battery chamber, and I'll show that later. In order to disassemble this battery holder, you only need... Well, I'm not even going to say, because you always end up using more screwdrivers than you expected. However, you should need a Phillips head screwdriver and a small standard slotted screwdriver. So here's a Phillips head, and here is a slotted screwdriver. We'll see if we need anything beyond that. So these are 3 slotted screws. So simply remove them. That one's a little bit large. Let me get down to the next size. The blade was actually not sharp enough. Okay, 1, 2, and let's see, is this one going to come out? It actually will come out. Needs a helping hand. There it goes. So once you remove that, this piece just slides out. So you have to lift. This piece actually is a separate piece. This little plastic cap. But you want to remove this battery holder or this contact point. These are really battery contact points. So you can stretch it a little bit. And then get under here, either with a screwdriver or pointer or some other type of tool. Here's sometimes where it helps to have many screwdrivers. All right, there you go. And then this comes out here. There is a small little post that also will come out. Come on out. Oh, that's held in place now by this piece. All right, now here comes the tricky part. You're going to have to remove all three of these screws. The two screws in front are simple. The third one in the back is more difficult because generally you either need a super long screwdriver, and this one is just a bit short, or you will need to figure out a different way. So I figured out a different way. Of course I did. So first, let's remove these screws. See, the number of tools that you use begins to grow rather quickly. All right, because I couldn't reach that screw, what I did was I actually pulled up on this and then began to twist. Luckily, that screw wasn't corroded, so by applying pressure to it, it began to unwind the screw itself. See, am I able to reach that? Oh, yes, I am. Barely able to reach that. If you have a smaller screwdriver, Phillips head, which I don't at the moment, you might be able to get it in there at an angle and loosen it. This is another way, though. There. Small spring, another one of these posts, and so this is what you're left with. Now this piece you have to put back on, because if you see these little ears, they line up with the small notches here, with these small notches. While you don't need the notches, it does make it easier to put back in. So this is fairly simple. So all you really have to do now is take this and screw it back on. Now, you can use any of these screws. You can use the long screws or you can use the shorter screws. And in fact, sometimes it's a bit easier to use the shorter screws. If you lose these screws, they're small enough, you probably could find a replacement on the internet somewhere to buy some new ones. Here you go. There's one. Whoops. Here's two, and then here's the third one. I decided to use the shorter ones just because they're going to be the most appropriate, and I'll explain why in a second. There. Well, this needs to be tightened down just a bit more. It extends too far still. Let's go with the wider blade screwdriver. Whoops. Let's see if that one gives me slightly more leverage. There we go. Okay, as I mentioned, these two little ears or extensions just match up with these slots here. So when you do replace the battery cap or battery cover, it slots in very easily. Now, if you recall, I decided to use this version, the shorter screws, and the reason is because originally this was on the bottom, and so that took up a lot of the screw space. Without this spacer here, which is this part of the assembly, or actually, in reality, this part of the assembly doesn't really matter. It's roughly the same. So what happens is these screws are actually too long when you remove that piece. That's really about it. If you wanted to, you could take one of these posts and you could solder to the cap here. If you do that, I would suggest you get a piece of paper and round that down make it really smooth. Or you could just put a little ball of solder right in the middle here. If you decide to do that, use silver bearing solder because it's going to harden much better than regular rosin core solder. The battery post that's inside here, I don't know if I can show this, but it actually is sprung. You just have to take my word for it. Or if you have one of these cameras, just stick your finger in there and you can see how it can push that in. So that maintains pressure on the battery on the positive side. One of the challenges, and the reason I suggest you solder another nub here, whether it be this little post here or piece of solder, is because of the contact point of contacting the negative end of the battery. Oh, the other reason you want to leave these ears on is this completes the circuit. By allowing this part of the battery cap to touch this completes the circuit. So as I mentioned, sometimes the coverings on these batteries is so deep, it comes in so far that it actually cannot make contact with your battery cap. That's why I suggest adding, like I said, a small bead of solder here. Small bead of solder, or just taking this post and soldering it onto it. You also could take that spring, wherever it was. Yes, you can solder that. And I've done that with one of my cameras. So with this one, you could see how I took one of those contact posts and I soldered it to this battery cap. And it works pretty well. I've never had a problem with it. The final thing that I do, and I do this with all of these cameras, and I will have to remove it to show it to you. Is I make this small insulator. And it does two things. It keeps the battery from rattling around, and it allows the battery just to, because of how this works, the battery actually is going to rotate, or might rotate. You can see how that post actually rotates. If there's sufficient pressure from the positive end and the negative end, there is a chance that this battery will rotate in place. So this is just like a nice little thing, little spacer in there. So what's it made from? It's really just the side of a milk carton. The milk carton is extremely slippery, and it's right about the right width. So the dimensions of this, very simple, is, I would say, 54 millimeters by 20, well, I didn't really cut it even, so on this end it is 25 millimeters, and on this end it's about 27 millimeters. In inches, that's going to be about an inch and an eighth down to 1 inch. And width-wise, that would be about 2 1/4 inches. So after you cut your piece, just simply take it, and if you want, sometimes what I've done is I've taken a pencil or something, or even like a AA battery, for example. AA battery works well. You can just use this to sort of wrap around it, give it its initial shape. Take it, slide it into your battery chamber, and it can remain there forever. Then when you slip your battery in, you can now slide on, well, you know what? Let's do it with the new one. You see what I mean? So in this case, the battery isn't completing the circuit. So let's put on my other cap. This is the one that I had soldered that small post to. Oh, there we are. Now I know I have a battery in here, so let's take a look. Let's try a different battery. Now on this battery, the covering on the bottom doesn't come in quite as far. By the way, if you wanted to, you could always get a small knife and just trim away that excess. See how it works in this camera. Oh, this one doesn't have a you know what? That one doesn't have a battery check. So let's put the cap on here, the battery cap here, tighten it down. See, still doesn't want to, nope, still not making good contact. So, as I mentioned, let's pull, let me remove this. And on this cap, this is an earlier version, I'd taken this spring, I believe I cut it in half, and I soldered part of it. I soldered part of it to the cap here. So in this case, we'll take this one, we'll slot it in there, and there you go. This one works. If you've not done any soldering, it's very simple. You really just, this entire cap is metal, so that's always a good sign. Just hold it in place, run some solder around it, and you're good to go. Because of the chrome plating, you might want to rough this up a bit with some sandpaper, or even just get like a small penknife if you have one, and scrape that cover. Just scrape away some of the plating. It will help the solder spread. You could even do something like this, for example. That's it. So I do want to talk about this camera real quickly. There are a couple things I wanted to mention about it. I think I mentioned that there's some slight differences between the three cameras. And so these are really comparable models, but they're not clones. What is interesting is with this model, there's this little lever right here. And what that is that's a self-timer. And so if you were to, well, let's go ahead and crank that film. We'll sacrifice a photo. So you take that. And you get about a 10-second delay. Both of these have the same amount of information in the viewfinder. All three of these cameras have the same amount of information in the viewfinder. The scale focus camera has a little pictogram on the left side of the viewfinder, and what it shows is a mountain, a group of people, and then a single person. That way you can judge your distance without having to take your eye away from the camera. Across the top is a scale that shows all the apertures, and then running down the right side is a scale that shows the shutter speeds, running from 1/500th down to 30. And depending on the aperture you choose, you'll see the meter float up and down, and it will indicate what speed. Even though the indicated speeds only run from 1/500th down to 1/30th, I think it will go up to 4 seconds, roughly 4 seconds. Same is true with these cameras too. So these do away with the pictograms on the left side. However, each of these do have the aperture scale on the top and the shutter speeds running down alongside on the right. So this makes all these cameras aperture priority cameras, aperture priority auto exposure cameras. Here's your apertures. They change by using this tab here. That's really where runs from 6 to 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock to 4 o'clock as you look at the camera. With the rangefinder equipped models, you pull out the focusing ring and it becomes a lens shade. This one has distances marked only in meters, while this one has dual, feet and meters. This also has a depth of field scale, while the Zeiss Ikon camera does not. To set the film speed, you either have a choice of ASA or DIN, and of course on this one, you just have a choice of DIN. DIN was the European film speed scale. To change the film speed, and what you do is there's a small lever here. You press it in and you rotate it until your desired film speed shows up in the window. Film speeds run from 25 to 400. And so that's not unusual given the type of camera this is. This is a simpler camera, even though it is a rangefinder model. For this camera, it's slightly different. There's a small little nub here, small little post. You actually pull that out and rotate it to set your desired film speed. And on this one, DIN is on one side of the camera and ASA is on the other side. ASA became ISO. So if you're used to using ISO, fine. You continue using it. As you can see, this is a Prontor 500S electronic. Here the shutter isn't indicated, but it most likely is the same shutter because it wouldn't make sense to have, at that point, it wouldn't make sense to have two different types of shutters in two different cameras. For simplifying your assembly and manufacture, it makes sense to just use one type of shutter, particularly if you're going to be using the same lens, which in this case, as I mentioned, is a f2.8 40 millimeter lens. If you recall, the Rollei 35 also used the it used an f3.5 40 millimeter lens. However, it also had the option a bit later in its life of a f2.8 40 millimeter sonar. So always something with these cameras. Let me see. Oh yes, as I mentioned, all three cameras have an indicator that shows whether the film is advancing. And they all came with did they all come with a case? I don't know if the case was optional. You'll often see a braided neck strap. Attaches to your strap lugs here on either side. This is more like a braided rope neck strap. This particular camera has a rubber lens shade. It did not come with the camera. This is aftermarket. However, it is an official Zeiss Ikon accessory. The fitted case is usable by both cameras, or all three cameras, I guess I should say. Simply slips in here, and then it zips shut. There was a hard case for this too. The hard case is not quite as convenient. However, it is available for those who wish to prefer a hard case. I can't recall if I thought I might have seen where somebody was making an aftermarket case recently, and it was, a very nice premium leather case. The box camera that I showed you in the front, that one was sold in 1971. I believe these were released, might have been late 60s, like 69 or so. By 1972, Zeiss Ikon had shut down entirely. So whatever inventory remained in the sales channel, continued to be sold, but no more cameras were made by Zeiss Ikon after that. Rollei eventually bought the Voigtlander name and continued to produce parallel cameras with many of its SLRs. It also made an XF35 and it made a Voigtlander VF135. That camera is not good, and I'll review that at some point. It's probably on the bottom 5, possibly number 2 on the worst cameras of all time, or on my list of worst cameras of all time. I've actually shot this camera. I enjoyed using it. I've used the scale focus model. I had a lot of fun with it. It was very simple to use. It's heavier than you would expect for being a small camera. So let's do a weigh-in. You'll notice that the background has changed in this. Now we're going to do the weigh-in over again because one thing I noticed when I edited the video was that it appeared to be showing 0.8 ounces when I did the weigh-ins. So let's start over. This is the S310, so that's 15.4 ounces. Here's the S312, That's 1.0 ounces, 1 pound, 0.2 ounces. And here's the Voigtlander VF101. Oh, interesting. So this one is slightly lighter in weight than the S312. They're almost identical, probably mechanically identical, 90%. This one, if you recall, has a self-timer and a flash synchronization post, which this one lacks, but this one, however, is weighs slightly more. Always some surprise waiting for you when it comes to photography. These three models are also notable in, well, really this model is sort of noticeable. This and the SL706 single lens reflex camera, they're notable in the fact that they don't have model names. In the history of Zeiss Ikon, they generally, every camera had a name, like a Contessa or a Iconta or a Contax, Contarex, Contaflex, etc., etc. They always had camera names. So this one, the fact that it was S312, I think it probably was an indication that Zeiss Ikon was just really struggling at the end and just had sort of given up giving its cameras real actual names. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to press that like and or subscribe button. And if you'd like to see me cover a different camera in the future, please let me know in the comments below or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. Until next time, keep on taking photographs.